we ask for God's help. Dear Heavenly Father, we pray that you would open our hearts to hear your voice. We pray that as we read and hear your voice in Scripture, we would care more and more for your glory and the eternal good of others. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So let's read 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and beginning at verse 23. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, "This has been offered in sacrifice," then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. It is our fourth and final sermon in our short series through 1 Corinthians 8 to 10. I trust that what we have read and considered thus far has been helpful in challenging all of us and our attitudes towards our freedoms and how we make decisions as we relate to each other as Christians and with our friends and neighbors who don't share our faith. If you haven't been with us, we have been asking big questions such as, what would you be willing to give up for the sake of your fellow Christian brother or sister? Or how do we engage with the world around us? How far would you go to share the gospel with an unbeliever? What are you going to use your freedoms for? For ourselves or for others? These questions were incredibly relevant to the people of Corinth, who this letter was written to. Why? Because they lived in a city full of idolatry, worship of other and false gods. The city was jam-packed with temples and worship of many gods. So for them, it was really important to ask, how free are we to engage with the world around us? Can we go to the same feasts and ceremonies that our friends and colleagues are going to? And the default answer for the Corinthians was, yes, of course we can go. We know our Bibles, we know our rights, we're Christians, and we're really clear that there's only one God and that the idols aren't real. So of course we can go along. These questions were also relevant because in the culture of Corinth, which was making its way into the church, it was all about me firstism, living for me now rather than thinking about others. The author of this letter, Paul, wanted to change their perspective completely and shift how they thought about these questions by thinking outside themselves and thinking and acting like the Lord Jesus. And so we arrive at our passage this evening. Paul is going to tie up some loose ends and present the Corinthians and us the ultimate set of principles we need to use when considering our freedoms as Christians. Firstly, Can we do this to God's glory? And secondly, does it seek the eternal good of my neighbor? Our plan this evening is to look at the two big principles and then consider Paul's worked out examples. We'll think about what it meant for the Corinthians then and what it means for us now. So if you have ever wondered what Christians should do as we interact with Pride Month, or if we should attend a yoga class, or send our kids to a Halloween party, we will get there. But first, the principles. And principle 1, do all to God's glory. Paul's long and thoughtful section on food comes to a head in one of his most quotable sentences. You'll find it there in verse 31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. This is the bottom line for a Christian, and it's Paul's super summary teaching on everything, not just food. It's the natural conclusion to what we saw in chapter 8, verse 6. If you know there is only one God, through whom everything exists and for whom everything exists, then of course, every minute of every hour of every day, we live for that God. And so if you are taking part in something which God has given, do it with thankfulness for his grace and kindness. And if you're abstaining from it, do it out of a desire that other people don't stumble. This is an amazing verse that Christians will quote all the time, but it also serves as a huge challenge for us. If you are facing one of these tricky situations, if you're considering whether or not to participate in an activity, if you're making any decision of any kind, it's worth asking, can I honestly do this to God's glory? That immediately rules out anything God forbids or speaks out against in his word. But this is also helpful in the gray areas. Can I give him thanks in this activity? Or am I joining in with the thanks and worship going somewhere else? I'm a big football fan, no secret to many of you. I have to ask myself the question, what would it mean for me to support my teams to God's glory? What songs won't I sing at the stadium? How will I interact with other fans? At work, where's the line between serving God in the office versus joining in with the materialism and the mantra that says that money makes the world go round? These are questions Christians need to grapple with. And I'm not here to give a definitive answer for every single situation. We have to think with this principle in mind. Can I honestly do this to the glory of God? It's complicated. It might be easier to just say no to a lot of things, but that's why Paul gives us the second principle we apply to our decisions, prioritizing the eternal good of my neighbor. So the second principle, seek the eternal good of your neighbor. I think it's really interesting. Our passage last week ended at verse 22 with a warning about God's jealousy, challenging Christians to think vertically with God's glory in mind. And then immediately in verse 23, the focus shifts. From verse 23, it says, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Quite interesting, isn't it? Straight from undivided devotion to God into thinking about your neighbor. And the same goes for verses 31 to 32, from do all to the glory of God. And then immediately in verse 32, think about people around you. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God. And so I guess if we put everything together, living for the glory of God does not mean retreating from my neighbors, but reaching out and seeking their good. I hope this doesn't surprise us. When Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, he replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The way that we glorify and love the one true creator God is shown in how we love those who he has made. If you're wondering who is my neighbor, the question that is posed by verse 24, well, verse 32 helpfully answers it for us. It's all sorts of people. Paul gave no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, people who don't know Jesus and our church family. And so we have our Christian neighbor and our unbelieving neighbor. If you've been tracking with us over the last 3 weeks, you'll remember that in chapter 8, Paul addresses how we love and serve our fellow Christians with our freedoms. We apply the principle of seeking our Christian neighbor's eternal good by remembering that love is more important than knowing things and being right all the time. We saw that in 8 verse 1. In chapter 8 verse 9, we also saw that we ought to take care of the rights that we have so that they don't become a stumbling block to others. And in chapter 8 verse 13, we saw that we ought to be willing to do anything, even going vegetarian, so that our Christian family won't stumble. Similarly, Paul wants us to apply seeking the eternal good of our neighbor in relation to people who aren't Christians, to our unbelieving neighbor. Paul says at the end, imitate Jesus just as I do. Live for God's glory, yes, but get alongside people who are worshiping idols. What is our neighbor's good? Well, verse 33 gives us the answer. I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. That they may be saved. That is the primary good, the eternal good of our neighbor, that they may be saved. All human beings worship something. And if you're not worshiping the one true God who made you and made everything, you are on a collision course with reality. So Paul, in seeking the good of his neighbor, was always seeking for chances to speak about Jesus. And we've seen that, haven't we? That was the theme of chapter 9 in our series. Chapter 9, verse 19 says, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. And just a few verses down from verse 22 in chapter 9, I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. Paul went around going as far as he could culturally to meet people where they were at, all that he could share the good news about Jesus. What does that look like for us? I have friends who have told me that a big aim in their befriending of people who aren't Christians and doing certain activities, like, for example, going to the pub or watching certain TV shows, is so that people don't think that Christians are as weird as they're portrayed. Now, that can be a necessary thing sometimes. Last week, I met someone for the first time, and they had a lot of questions about my Christian faith, and it was good to challenge some preconceptions about us Christians being prudes who hate having fun. There are lots of misunderstandings about Christianity. However, Paul wouldn't have settled for just that. His aim in life wasn't to be popular or to have people think that Christians are all right. His ultimate aim was really clear. He wanted for people to be saved, and so he looked for opportunities to speak about Jesus. He did so both for their eternal good and for God's glory. And that is how the two principles fit together. For God's glory, Paul would seek to win people to salvation. Jesus is the only man who ever lived for God's glory every day, the only man who ever loved his neighbor as himself, and his priorities were really clear. He was compassionate, and not just to heal or feed, but to proclaim good news of eternal forgiveness should people repent and believe in him. That's how he sought their good. And that's the priority to imitate. Now, that doesn't mean that we drop a gospel outline bomb into every conversation we have with any new person we meet. Paul invested his life alongside people. It took time to reason and persuade people with love and truth. Paul lovingly invested in people, joining people on their cultural terms and going through that pain barrier. So those are our two principles. Like Paul and Jesus, we are to live and make decisions about our rights to the glory of God, which will involve prioritizing the eternal good of our neighbors, which is their salvation. In other words, is my Christianity marked by me firstism, or is it marked by sacrifice and giving up of my rights to give God glory and benefit others? Paul helpfully doesn't leave those two big principles floating around, but gives us some specific case studies to help us apply these principles. I think Paul's worked examples in verses 25 to 30 are really helpful, because the answer to whether Christians can engage in certain activities in an idolatrous world isn't always no and isn't always yes. It takes hard work. So why don't we look at the principles in practice? So Paul has spent the best part of 3 chapters now explaining to the Corinthians why they should not eat food sacrificed to idols in the context of pagan worship. So is he going back on himself here when he says that it's okay to eat some of the meat? Well, no, the issue is slightly different. You see, idol food in Roman Corinth wasn't just something you would encounter at the pagan temples, but also at the Tesco of the day, the local meat market, or at someone's home if you've been invited out to dinner. So although the discussion of idol food at the temple dining halls is finished, there are still a couple of loose ends for Paul to tie up. He does so in 2 short paragraphs, one dealing with the market and one dealing with the dinner parties. If it's at all helpful, I've summarized Paul's argument in your handout and in the graph on the screen beside me. And that kind of gives you an idea of where we've been in chapters 8 to 10 so far. So firstly, at the heart of it is a problem we've encountered before. Shall we turn back to verse 23? You'll notice, I think in the ESV, all things are lawful are in quotation marks because we suspect this is something that the Corinthian Christians were saying. Verse 23 says, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. For the Corinthian Christians, freedom is all about their own rights. All things are lawful, or I have the right to do anything. These statements are further evidence of the Corinthians' case of me-firstism. Why is that important to the question of where they bought their meat? Well, as followers of Jesus, we are not just to ask whether something is lawful, but whether it is loving. Plenty of things aren't banned or illegal, but they're not beneficial either. So what should believers in Corinth do when they go to the meat market? It's worth briefly noting that in Corinth, the chances were pretty high that the meat you'd find at the counter had previously been offered as a sacrifice to a pagan god. If you really wanted to avoid eating sacrificed food, it would involve either avoiding meat altogether or a very pedantic and fussy inquiry into the origins of every meal they ate. Meat in Corinth didn't come neatly packaged and labeled free range or corn-fed or with a big red tick that said it was okay for Christians to have. So what should they do? Paul's answer is simple and liberating, and we find it in verse 25. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. This makes it crystal clear that Paul's problem with idol food was not the meat, but the meaning. Christians should not participate in pagan worship, but that doesn't mean that any meat which has previously been offered in sacrifice is off limits. In fact, Paul quotes from Psalm 24, there in verse 26 in our Bibles. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Since God made everything, since he is the one true God, Christians are free to eat anything and free not to. But what about if you were invited to a dinner party where meat was going to be served? Previously, the answer has either been no to eating at the pagan temples and yes to buying meat from the market. But now it's a little more complex with private homes. Why? Well, there are more moving parts. There's you, your host, and any other guest who might be there. And that all needs to be factored in. So Paul lays out the scenario. An unbeliever invites you to their home for a meal, and you want to go. In that situation, you should eat whatever is put in front of you, whether it include meat or not, and you shouldn't raise any question or any conscience questions about it. It's kind of similar to the market, right? There's meat in front of you. You don't know where it came from, but the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So there's no point in worrying about it and needlessly offending your host. Enjoy your stay. But then the scenario changes slightly. Now there's another guest who tells you that the meat has been offered in sacrifice. It's idol food previously served as part of a pagan worship in a temple. Now, if the person who tells you that is a Christian, they're probably concerned, and your eating meat could give them a problem along the lines of what Paul has discussed already in chapter 8. But even if the person who tells you isn't a Christian, it could still be difficult for them in that if they see a Christian knowingly eating sacrificial food, they might conclude that pagan sacrifice is compatible with Christianity. Different circumstances mean a different decision. And Paul is clear, this is because of their conscience, not of the Corinthian Christians' conscience. But in verse 29, he makes the point that as long as the Christians are receiving things with thankfulness, there is very little to worry about. So those are the scenarios for them then. But what about us? I can't imagine that the last time you were at Morrison's, you asked a member of staff if the chicken was sacrificed to idols or not. I can't imagine it's a consideration when you go over to someone's for dinner. Whatever the situation we are faced with, whether it's tricky or not, whatever the decision we are faced with, these two principles apply. Can I do it to God's glory? And does it seek the eternal good of my neighbor? It requires situational thinking. Even gathered here tonight, there are different people with different personalities and different Christian backgrounds, and will probably tend towards the challenge to be more careful or the challenge to be more engaged. And discussion amongst us afterwards would probably be really helpful on this. All the time our heart is to love God and our neighbor. But let's try and illustrate the thought process. Our job as a church and mine as the preacher tonight isn't to give you the answers to every single possible scenario, but it is to model the way of thinking that we apply as Christians. Here's an example. Yoga, I mentioned it earlier. The first sermon I ever preached a couple of years ago, it included a talk on New Year's resolutions. And I got several unhappy comments because I suggested it as part of a long list of things you might choose to do in your resolution. But you're invited to yoga by your colleague or by one of your fellow students. Should you go? On the second principle, prioritizing the eternal good of your neighbor, you'd probably love to go. What a great way to love them, and an opportunity for you to get to know them outside of class or the office, and possibly share about Jesus with them. But on the first principle, can I do yoga to the glory of God? Well, we ask the questions that we've got in front of us. Is it participation in idolatry? Now, Christians would differ on the answer to this question. Some would think it's just a physical exercise, not much more than healthy stretching. And others would say, hang on, its roots are in Eastern spirituality and connection with pantheistic gods. And different classes, I guess, different yoga groups would emphasize different aspects. Some yoga classes would focus on the meditation, and others would say it's just a workout class at the gym. So since there are different consciences and opinions, the question of the weaker brother becomes really important. There were lots of Indian Christians in my old church in Aberdeen, and for them, any participation in yoga and the poses cannot be divorced from the spiritual element and opening oneself to gods other than the God of the Bible. But for that Christian, it would be about finding maybe another way of interacting with their colleague or their classmate, maybe Pilates instead of yoga. But imagine someone else going to a class, one of these yoga classes, and they experience a verse 28 kind of moment. It's a perfectly normal exercise group until the moment the instructor says, take a deep breath and connect with the life force that the earth gives you. Suddenly, it becomes a spiritual activity, a worship activity. For that person, That's the moment perhaps when they decide to go to a different class or to leave that group altogether. Does it sound a little bit complicated, all this thinking and all these questions and principles that we ought to be applying? Wouldn't it be easier to just turn down the invite? Glorifying God doesn't mean we run away from our neighbors. And so we do the hard work. Here's another example. What about Halloween? I grew up in a home where on the 31st of October, we would turn off all the lights and pretend we weren't home. I think that was more my dad's anti-socialness more than any deeply held convictions. But what should we do? Do we participate? Send our kids to Halloween parties? How do we think like Christ? Well, we work through the questions. We apply the principles. Is it participation in idolatry? Is it idol worship? Well, from the roots of the festival and its character, there is a sort of celebration of evil, at least a form of trivializing the occult. If that's true, then what does participation look like? Godly families, I know, would dress up in a costume, but clearly not a Halloween scary thing costume. I know of one family who do pumpkins, but carve Bible verses into them instead of scary faces. For a lot of churches, a positive alternative to Halloween is a light party, a way to engage with the people around them, but in a wholesome way that points to Christ. What about this one? Hillary and I were discussing what we would do if we received an invitation to a same-sex wedding. The principles are the same, and we work through it. Can I glorify God while I'm there? Can I minimize cultural offense and engage with the people around me? Can we engage and still glorify God? Come chat to me after if you want to hear our thinking or would like to contribute some of your wisdom. We need careful situational thinking, driven by the heart that Christ had, to reach people so that they might be saved. Heart desiring to glorify God and seek the eternal good of men, their salvation. Let's pray for God's help. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the Lord Jesus, the only one who perfectly, every moment of every day, lived for your glory, the only person who loved their neighbor as themselves. Please help us to imitate Christ as Paul did. Help us to think through difficult situations by putting in the hard work of thinking with the wisdom of Christ. Please help us to think about whether things give you glory and whether they seek the eternal good of others. And if that means giving up of our rights for the sake of others, then please help us to humbly do so. Father, please help us to put all these things into practice as we meditate and reflect on them in the week to come. In Jesus' name, amen. We are going to close our time.